Good morning and welcome to Rising. We've got a great show for you today. Kim, who do we have?
Yeah, I'm here all morning long, guys. We also have friend of the show, Emily Jashinsky. She's going to discuss Ghislaine Maxwell's guilty verdict, and Matt Taibbi discusses how Dems are botching their approach to education.
The CDC's new 5-day isolation recommendation is creating some confusion among Americans, me as well, drawing criticism from some medical experts. The new rule allows people to leave isolation without getting tested to see if they're still infectious. Yesterday, Dr. Fauci addressed the CDC's new guidelines and admitted that the decision is, quote, not completely risk-free.
The purpose of it is that given the wave, the extraordinary, unprecedented wave of infections that we are experiencing now and will certainly experience more of in the next few weeks, that there is the danger that there will be so many people who are being isolated, who are asymptomatic for the full 10 days, that you could have a major negative impact on our ability to keep society running. So the decision was made, although it's not completely risk-free, of saying, let's get that cut in half so that we could have 50%, namely half of the 10 days, and 50% of that time, people can actually be out with a mask in society.
Fauci's flip-flopping on the science is creating skepticism among citizens looking for guidance amid the current spike in cases. But over at MSNBC, Nicole Wallace wasted no time fawning over Fauci. Here's some of that.
Yeah, I mean, Jason, you see how difficult this is for this administration. I mean, I'm a Fauci groupie. I'm a thrice vaccinated mask adherent. I buy KN95 masks by the, caseload. They're in every pocket. I wear them everywhere except when I sit down. And I am certain that this is not a variant I can outrun.
Yikes. I mean, look, she's vaccinated and boosted. She's still wearing masks everywhere. This is, a lot of people see that. And you have one guy and he's smiling, almost cheering her on like, oh, that is really great. You're being really, really ultra responsible. But when is this over, right? I mean, when are people going to be able to go back to some sort of normalcy? I mean, if you've been vaccinated, boosted, and you're still carrying around all these masks in every single pocket, I mean, this is the type of stuff that people look at and they say, oh, my gosh, this is really, truly never going to end. That first of all, the Nicole Wallace clip is particularly, I think, indicative of the mentality of a lot of people still in the country at the moment. But going back to Fauci and the CDC guidelines, this is something that this is so bothersome for so many reasons. First of all, look, why did we shut down the country in the very beginning? Remember 2 years ago or almost 2 years ago when we were locking down the country, it was because of asymptomatic spread, because they didn't know if a person, if they didn't have symptoms, they were saying, well, you never know, you could still be killing grandma. And so we shut down the entire economy, the global economy, in order to stop that asymptomatic spread. And now it's, well, look, if you're asymptomatic, you're not really going to spread this thing, which is what they kind of said originally. And then they changed and said, oh, no, everybody can kill everybody. And then now they're going back to this.
Well, and they're changing it.
Again, it's flip-flopping.
No, exactly. And they're changing it. Fauci admitted that. I actually thought this was a rare moment of just brutal honesty from Fauci when he said, well, look, this thing is so infectious, you're going to have everybody on Earth quarantining for like a ridiculous amount of time. It's just not possible to do it. So we're saying do it only 50% of that because it's not feasible. So I actually totally agree with that. But that is so tonally different from everything he has said up to now. There has been no, admission previously from Fauci and other public health bureaucrat type people that we're weighing that we're looking at trade-offs. Well, what about the negative consequences of doing this? This is the first time he said, yeah, it looks like, doing what we would optimally want to do from our standpoint to protect everybody. It's just too much and we can't really ask that of people, so we're not going to. But what about school closures? What about locking down businesses? What about making people wear masks on airplanes for 9 hours if they have a long flight? Like, for all of that stuff, it was like, well, no, the science says to be safe, you have to do this. So now, and I think it has something to do with, Biden is president and they're, the team blue, the liberal media, Democratic politicians, the most, hardcore anti-COVID people are realizing that like it's not working. all of their militancy is not beating this thing, and there's a reasonable and long overdue amount of, well, we kind of just got to let people do their own thing then, that is refreshing but utterly hypocritical given what came before it.
Well, and especially since in my radar later, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the Great Barrington Declaration and how those scientists were called fringe, and they were cast out and ostracized and treated like they were some sort of pariah on society. And they were calling for this nearly exact playbook for how to live with COVID. And now we're there. Now they're saying, well, we can't shut down the economy and disrupt large sectors of society. One thing that really also bothers me a lot about this CDC guideline. Now, I'm with you. I think, hey, look, at this point, finally people are coming to their senses that we cannot defeat this thing and we're going to have to somehow learn to live with it. But they're still treating. So if you've been exposed to the virus and you're vaccinated versus unvaccinated, they're treating you differently. So they're saying if you're unvaccinated, you have to isolate for longer. This is a negative test. You've not tested positive for the virus, and you still have to isolate versus, and if you're unvaccinated, longer than if you're vaccinated. And then they say, but if you've tested positive, so now you've got COVID, which makes you actually the dangerous spreader, right? Because you have it. So now they're saying if you have COVID, then you're treated the same unless you're boosted, I believe, is what they're.
It makes very little sense.
Yeah. It's none of it is really making any sense, but that's how it's going at this point. I think a lot of people are starting to just kind of ignore it. But another thing, the spike in cases isn't unique to the U.S. We're seeing this trend all around the world. And Israel, now we haven't heard about them in a while, but they are now weighing whether or not to approve a fourth COVID vaccine dose, as nearly 3,000 new cases are seen in the country for a second day straight. So they are seeing that curve go back up. Currently, their vaccine mandate requires 3 shots. So everyone has to be boosted, even to enter the country. But scientists are warning against another dose. And they're saying that too many shots may lead to immune system fatigue, compromising the body's ability to fight the coronavirus. So just yesterday, new reports reveal that Israel's senior health officials are considering a switch to a policy of reaching herd immunity through mass infection. Can I just say, again, like I mentioned with the Great Barrington Declaration, epidemiologists and medical doctors, this was considered a conspiracy theory. The idea that vaccinating and vaccinating again would compromise your immune system. There were scientists who were who were raising the alarm about this early on, and they have been, again, smeared and subject of defamation, and they were saying this. And now the Israeli scientists are saying, this might be a thing. They're saying this because they're seeing evidence of it. That is why they're saying it. And they're saying that they want to see more. They're waiting for more data. They want to wait on whether or not to introduce that fourth booster dose. A lot of them say, well, the risk outweighs the reward. Others are saying we're still seeing some of this risk. We need to kind of gather more data. So they are at this point waiting to see if they can gather more data on whether or not it does affect your immune system negatively to be dosing, dose after dose after dose. But they know after the third booster, it wears off again. And that's what they're finding. It wears off.
Well, I read that story, and it looked like, yes, it is the protection against infection lowers. According to the New York Times story, the protection against severe disease and death is not waning as much, and that's the important thing. So I don't know why, if you still have that, even the new variants are so infectious, that's the thing we got to worry about. So that's good. If we're still holding up against that, great. That's like the best we can do at this point. So it's just kind of ridiculous. But flawed testing and a shortage of tests in the U.S. is certainly not helping. CNN medical correspondent Elizabeth Cohen explained that the flaws of the at-home rapid test, saying that the test will be wrong 35% of the time if you have COVID with symptoms, and the test will be wrong 64% of the time if you're symptomatic. And I watched her say that, and I'm actually not sure she presented that information correctly, because what the rapid test is measuring is infectiousness, which is actually a better thing. Whereas the PCR test, you could still be testing positive because you have dead virus particles still inside you, even though you're not infectious and you're over the disease. So it's not, I thought they kind of presented that in a very, well, a typically dishonest way, but.
I agree with you. In fact, there is a study, I'd have to dig it up, but I do remember reading a study showing that if you took the rapid antigen test, that was actually the most, the best way to prevent the spread of the virus was people taking those rapid antigen tests and then knowing to isolate and stay home if they came out positive. And it was better in that study than the PCRs. It was better than masking. It was better than everything. They said if you test positive, stay home.
But the government and their allies on mainstream media don't want to admit that because they screwed up letting everybody have access to those tests. So they can't admit that the best thing would be for everybody to have those tests and be able to take them all the time because it's their fault we don't.
Yeah, that was their last thing. They were like, oh, no, you don't need to do that. Do everything else but that. Right. And so now it's like, oh, whoops. Well, CNN's Caitlin Collins pressed CDC Director Rochelle Walensky on the agency's fluctuating guidance on COVID and lack of testing. So let's take a look at that.
Well, so our guidance was conservative before. It has said 10 days of isolation, but in the context of the fact that we were going to have so many more cases, many of those would be asymptomatic or mildly symptomatic. People would feel well enough to be at work. They would not necessarily tolerate being home, and that they may not comply with being home. This was the moment that we needed to make that decision and those changes.
The UK has also shortened its period of isolation to 7 days, but with a negative test on day 6 and day 7, a negative rapid test. Why didn't the CDC recommend taking a rapid test after those 5 days?
Yeah, really important question. So we do, just to be clear, recommend having a rapid test during your period of quarantine after you've been exposed. But we opted not to have that rapid test for isolation. Exactly. We opted not to have the rapid test for isolation because we actually don't know how our rapid tests perform and how well they predict whether you're transmissible during the end of disease. The FDA has not authorized them for that use. We don't know how they perform.
This is like facepalm. Especially with what you were just saying, if these tests are better at predicting infectiousness, then if you test positive, you might be infectious. So why? So, does that, okay. But no, you don't need to test to find out if you're infectious in order to get out of quarantine. It makes sense that, right, yeah.
It would be great if we had maybe a government organization that was dedicated, that had maybe vast amounts of funding to determine over a period of maybe 2 years a scientific question like which tests will help tell you if you're infectious or not. I think we already have the answer to those questions, but again, she can't admit it because it's their agency's fault that this is the way it is.
It was such a flub that now she's like, no, you don't need to test negative before you come out of quarantine. No problem. Go out there in the world.
Truly amazing. Just wear a mask for the rest of your life, just in case, because,
Right.
Yeah.
Just great. Well.
It never ends. We'll have much more COVID-related news and other things coming up for you. Kim and I really like to talk about the pandemic, so there'll be a lot of that on the show, but also some other good stuff, including on the Ghislaine Maxwell verdict, and we'll tell you what's on our radars coming up next.